What happens when two worlds collide in the middle of a stage, one shaped by years of untold stories, the other by the rules of the modern game? A country music legend, a symbol of defiance and resilience, walks into one of daytime television's most controversial spots. His presence, undeniably powerful. His message, unyielding. What follows isn't just another celebrity interview. It's a clash of ideologies, a challenge to conformity, and a test of authenticity. The question isn't just about who wins or loses here. It's about who's willing to stand in the face of everything, with nothing left to prove. What would you do if the world expected you to follow the rules, but your very essence told you to do the opposite? When Willie Nelson walked onto that stage, time seemed to pause. The applause filled the room, but it wasn't the usual cheer for a celebrity. It was a recognition of history. Willie, 80-something years old, a man who'd seen it all, wasn't just walking into a TV studio. He was walking onto a battlefield where the fight was for something much bigger than just a conversation. He knew it. The audience knew it. The producers knew it. This wasn't about winning favor. It was about staying true to who he was, regardless of the consequences. As he made his way to the chair, you could feel the weight of his journey in every step he took. The quiet confidence of someone who had seen the highs and the lows of life, the wars, the losses, the victories. It wasn't just his music that made him an icon. It was his unwavering ability to be himself, no matter the world around him. The spotlight on him was never an invitation to play by the rules. It was an opportunity to rewrite them. But here, in this moment, the question lingered in the air. How far are we willing to go to stay true to ourselves, even when the world is begging us to conform? Joy Behar, with her sharp wit and bold approach, was ready. The moment she leaned forward, you could tell she wasn't just here for another celebrity interview. She had her eyes set on something bigger, something that would make headlines. And she wasn't going to let Willie Nelson, the man who had lived through decades of rebellion and truth, walk away without confronting him. Willie, you've built a career around being the outlaw, the rebel, the man who defies every expectation. But looking at your history, your associations, some of the things you've said over the years, I've got to ask, is this all just an act, or do you truly believe in being this rebel without a cause? The question hung in the air like a charged wire, waiting for the spark. The studio fell silent. The audience leaned in. Joy's words were a challenge, a direct attack on the very identity Willie had cultivated. She wasn't just asking about his past. She was questioning the core of his being. Willie sat there, calm, composed, his weathered face betraying nothing. For a moment he didn't respond. His silence wasn't an avoidance, it was a statement. He'd been asked to step into a box, a narrative that had been written for him, and he wasn't going to let it define him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he answered with a calm but resolute voice, "I don't think I've ever been without a cause. Joy, I've always known what I stand for." And just like that, the tension in the room shifted. It wasn't just about defending a persona. It was about staying true to a life lived in full, unapologetic authenticity. Willie wasn't playing the role they expected. He wasn't going to let anyone box him in, no matter how hard they tried. But as the tension built, a question lingered. How often do we let others try to define us? And when do we decide to stop playing by their rules and start playing by our own? Willie's response wasn't just a defense. It was a quiet declaration of resistance. The room grew heavier, as if the air itself was trying to process the weight of what had just been said. Joy wasn't done, though. She pressed on, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. But when you look at your influence, Willie, when you have the power to shape opinions, to make a difference, why do you choose to remain neutral? Why not take a clear stance on issues that matter? She wasn't just questioning his actions. She was challenging his ethics, his very approach to the world. To Joy, neutrality was synonymous with cowardice, with a refusal to take responsibility. But to Willie, neutrality was a form of respect, a respect for the complexity of life, for the humanity in all of us, even in those with whom we disagree. Willie leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze steady. He didn't let her words shake him. Neutrality isn't fear, Joy. It's respect, he said slowly, each word deliberate. Respect for the fact that people are complicated, that life isn't just black and white. Maybe we don't all have to agree on everything to get along. It wasn't an answer she was prepared for. It wasn't the fiery rebuttal she expected, the dramatic response that would have given her the ammunition to fire back. No, it was calm, thoughtful, almost disarming. The tension in the room shifted. Joy's face tightened, her grip on the conversation slipping. For the first time, the complexity of Willie's position began to take root, not just for the hosts, but for everyone watching. What if he was right? What if the world's insistence on picking sides, on dividing everything into a battle of right versus wrong, was the problem? Have we become so obsessed with being right that we forget the power of understanding? How often do we force ourselves into categories that strip us of our humanity, our ability to empathize with others? The conversation was beginning to reveal more than just a clash of opinions. It was becoming a tug-of-war between two fundamentally different ways of seeing the world. Joy wasn't just arguing for a stance, she was arguing for a vision of the world that didn't leave room for ambiguity. To her, silence in the face of injustice wasn't a choice, it was a betrayal. But Willie wasn't just fighting for his right to remain neutral, he was fighting for his identity, his truth. As Joy pressed him again, asking why he wouldn't take a clear stance, Willie's voice became firmer, yet still steady. "You don't know who I've fought for, Joy," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "You don't know what I've done behind closed doors, for my family, for my friends, for causes that matter to me." For the first time in the conversation, Willie wasn't just speaking about ideals or philosophy. He was speaking about the heart of his personal struggle, the things he had quietly fought for over the years. It wasn't about being in the spotlight, about having the world's attention. It was about the things that mattered when the cameras weren't rolling, the causes he believed in that didn't come with hashtags or headlines. But Joy wasn't backing down. "If it matters so much to you, why not use your platform to speak out? You have millions of fans, Willie. You could make a difference with just one voice." The words stung, and Willie's jaw tightened. He had always chosen his battles carefully. He had never been one for grand gestures or empty words. "You don't get it, Joy," he replied, his voice a little sharper now. "I don't need to shout to make a difference. I've been doing this my whole life. I've stood for farmers, for the environment, for the rights of the disenfranchised. But I don't do it for applause. I do it because it's right." Joy shook her head. "You're hiding behind your silence," she challenged. "No," Willie said, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not hiding. I'm respecting people, respecting their right to disagree, respecting their right to have a different perspective. I'm not going to be your puppet or anyone else's." Willie wasn't just defending his silence, he was redefining it. In his mind, silence wasn't cowardice, it was an acknowledgement of the complexity of the world. He wasn't running from the truth. He was refusing to oversimplify it, and that question still lingered. How many of us feel pressured to speak up when we're not ready, when we don't have the full story, when the world demands our opinions before we've even had a chance to reflect? The room grew even tenser, the weight of the conversation pressing down on everyone. The audience shifted in their seats, unsure of what was coming next. Joy, unable to let go of the tension, dug in deeper. "Willie, when you have the kind of influence you do, don't you feel a responsibility to use that for good? You can't just sit back and pretend that what you say doesn't matter." Her words were heavy, like a challenge to his very character. It wasn't just about politics or taking a stance. It was about using his platform for something greater, something more meaningful. For Joy and many others, influence meant responsibility. You don't get to have a voice without owning the consequences of that voice. It was black and white in her mind. Willie's eyes softened, but his voice remained steady. "I do use my voice, Joy. I do it every time I step on a stage, every time I write a song. That's how I've always spoken out. I'm not going to be anyone's puppet just to fit into some mold of what you think is good." Joy wasn't satisfied. She wasn't looking for nuance. She wasn't interested in the complexity that Willie was presenting. "But you're staying neutral on so many important issues, Willie. When you don't speak up, it's the same as giving permission for the injustices to continue." For a moment, Willie didn't respond. His silence was not avoidance, but an acknowledgement of something much deeper. He wasn't rejecting the idea of responsibility. He was rejecting the idea of being controlled. He wasn't going to let anyone dictate the terms of his involvement. His responsibility, in his mind, was to think for himself, to give his voice when it was needed, not when it was demanded. "I'm not afraid to speak out when it matters," Willie said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "But I'm not going to reduce everything to a soundbite just to make people comfortable, or to make it fit into a neat narrative." Joy, visibly frustrated, leaned in closer. "You think it's all just a performance? This isn't about comfort, Willie. This is about accountability. And when you remain silent, you're complicit." Willie's voice never wavered. "I'm not complicit in anything, Joy. You're asking me to choose sides, to make it all black and white. But life isn't like that. It's messy. It's complicated. And sometimes, taking a side doesn't mean making everything easier. It means making everything harder." It was a standoff, not just in words, but in the very philosophies of life they represented. For Willie, neutrality wasn't cowardice. It was respect for the complexity of human experience. It was about finding a balance in a world that seemed to demand extremes. For Joy, and many in the audience, it felt like an abandonment of responsibility. And as this tug-of-war played out, one question hung in the air. How often do we let others dictate what doing good should look like? And how often do we try to fit our personal truths into someone else's definition of responsibility? Willie's words had cut through the tension like a sharp blade, but the fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The deeper the conversation went, the more personal it became. Joy, unable to contain her frustration, snapped, "So, you're telling me that staying neutral, refusing to pick a side, is some noble act? Is that what you really believe?" Willie, never one to back down from a challenge, didn't flinch. His voice, calm and steady, carried a weight that didn't need to be shouted. "I'm not hiding behind neutrality, Joy. I'm not afraid to take a stand. But I won't do it just because the world tells me I should. I'll do it when I believe it's right." In that moment, the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Willie wasn't giving her the answer she wanted. He was giving her the answer he believed in, and it wasn't going to be wrapped up in a nice, neat package. This wasn't about appeasing the public or satisfying expectations. This was about his integrity, his truth, and the courage it took to stay true to that. Joy's voice wavered. "But how can you just sit there and do nothing? You have millions of people listening to you. Your voice could change the world." Willie leaned in slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'm not doing nothing. I've lived my life standing up for things that matter. I've fought for the environment, for farmers, for rights that need to be heard. But I won't reduce everything I believe in to a headline." The audience shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement, others looking skeptical. The stage had become more than just a set for an interview. It had become a battleground where personal values collided with the world's expectations. The conflict between Joy's need for a clear stance and Willie's insistence on complexity was palpable. And in the midst of it all, one question echoed louder than any other. How many times do we give in to the pressure of making a statement, even when we know that statement doesn't truly reflect who we are? The conversation was reaching its boiling point, and you could feel the pressure in the room. Joy wasn't backing down, and neither was Willie. They were locked in a verbal dance, each trying to win the other over, but neither willing to give an inch. It was clear that this wasn't about the questions anymore. It was about something deeper. It was about power, influence, and the ability to control the narrative. "You're really going to walk out?" Joy's voice was sharp, incredulous. "This is how you handle a tough interview?" Willie's expression didn't change. He had already made his decision. "This isn't a tough interview, Joy. This is an ambush," he said, his tone flat. But the weight of the words hung in the air like a thick fog. The room was stunned. The audience, caught in the middle of a live confrontation, didn't know how to react. Some applauded, others were speechless, unsure of what they had just witnessed. But one thing was certain. They were witnessing a moment that would be talked about long after the cameras stopped rolling. Joy wasn't ready to let go. "You can't just leave, Willie," she called after him, her voice rising. "We're live. You can't just walk out." Willie turned back, just for a moment, his gaze meeting hers. There was no anger in his eyes, only calm, tired resignation. "Watch me," he said quietly. And with that, Willie Nelson, one of music's most iconic legends, walked off the stage. The cameras followed him as he made his way toward the exit. The room was in chaos, a mixture of stunned silence and nervous applause. No one knew what to do. This wasn't just another celebrity leaving an interview. This was a statement, a powerful message about standing firm in your truth, even when the world tries to push you off course. As Willie reached the door, he paused, and the weight of that pause felt like an eternity. For a moment, it seemed as if he might turn around, but he didn't. He walked out the door and it clicked shut behind him, leaving the world to process what had just transpired. How many times have you felt the pressure to stay in a situation that no longer serves you? How many times have you wanted to walk away, but stayed because the world told you it wasn't the right thing to do? As Willie's footsteps faded away, the studio was left in an eerie silence. The tension lingered, hanging heavy in the air. The camera lingered on the empty chair where the legend once sat, and the sound of shuffling papers and whispered conversations seemed louder than ever. Everyone in the room was processing what had just happened, but few could truly understand it. Whoopi Goldberg, ever the peacemaker, rose from her seat and moved toward the center of the stage. She held her hands up in a calming gesture, signaling for the chaos to die down. "Willie, please," she called out, her voice softer than it had been moments before. "Come on now, let's not do this. Let's talk this through." But Willie, with the ease of someone who had lived 1,000 moments like this, didn't even turn back. His silhouette was framed in the doorway, his presence still looming, but his mind already set on the choice he had made. The room waited, breaths held, but Willie's voice, strong and steady, cut through the silence, even though he no longer had a microphone. "I came here today thinking we could have a conversation," he said, his words carrying across the studio. "But what I see here, Joy, is not a conversation. You wanted a confession. You wanted me to apologize for being who I am, and that's not something I'm willing to do." Willie didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He didn't make excuses for his actions. He stood firm in his truth, unshaken by the pressure around him. His words weren't a retreat. They were a final declaration of independence from the world that expected him to conform to its ideals. The studio was left in stunned silence. Joy's face flushed red, and the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to respond. But no words came from her, only the quiet hum of the room filled with mixed emotions. Some of the audience clapped, unsure whether to cheer or reflect. Others were still trying to process what had just unfolded. Willie, the man who had spent his entire career defying expectations and challenging norms, had just walked away from one of the most influential platforms in television. It was a moment of clarity, a moment where he chose integrity over fame, truth over comfort. Willie slowly turned back to face the panel, his expression unreadable. "I respect you, Whoopi," he said quietly, "but I can't sit here and be told who I am by someone who doesn't know me." In that simple statement, Willie revealed more than just his refusal to conform. He revealed his willingness to sacrifice anything, fame, approval, comfort, just to stay true to himself. It was a moment of clarity, where he showed that no amount of public recognition, no stage too grand, could ever change who he was. And the question lingered. How often do we choose to compromise who we are in order to meet someone else's expectations? How often do we stay silent, afraid to be true to ourselves, because we fear the consequences of standing alone? As the doors closed behind Willie Nelson, the room remained in turmoil. The studio audience was divided. Some were applauding, giving him a standing ovation. Others sat frozen, still processing the gravity of what they had just witnessed. The moment was too profound to be summed up in a few words. It lingered in the air, heavy and raw. Whoopi Goldberg, ever the voice of reason, tried to regain control of the situation. She looked at the other hosts, her face a mixture of concern and respect. Maybe we didn't do it the right way, she said softly, almost to herself. But the words couldn't erase what had just happened. The damage, or perhaps the revelation, had already been done. As the cameras cut to a wide shot, the studio audience and millions of viewers were left with one thing. A question. What had we just seen? A celebrity walking out of an interview? Yes, but it was more than that. It was a statement, a bold proclamation of self-identity in the face of societal pressure. A refusal to play by the rules when those rules didn't align with personal truth. Willie's exit wasn't just an act of rebellion. It was an act of courage. He chose to walk away from something that wasn't serving him, something that wasn't true to who he was. In doing so, he showed us something profound. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is to say no when everything in the world is telling you to say yes. The lessons here go beyond the celebrity gossip, beyond the staged drama of a talk show. What Willie Nelson taught us in that brief, fleeting moment was about resilience, authenticity, and the importance of maintaining integrity in a world that often demands compromise. He didn't just walk off that stage. He walked off for the truth of his beliefs, and for the sake of being true to himself, no matter the cost. And as the room quieted down, we were left with the unspoken question. When faced with a moment where you must either conform or stand your ground, which path will you choose? It's easy to follow the crowd, to go with the flow, to say what's expected of you. But real courage isn't about doing what's easy, it's about doing what's right. Willie didn't back down, even when he knew it might cost him public approval, career opportunities, or the praise of others. He walked away not in defeat, but in victory. Because in that moment, his victory was in staying true to who he was. We may not all be in the spotlight, but we all face moments where we are called to stand for something, to speak out when the world asks us to stay silent, to choose integrity over acceptance. Willie's walk-off wasn't just about him, it was about all of us. It was about having the strength to stand firm in our beliefs, no matter the external pressures. So, the real question is this. In your life, when it feels like the world is pushing you to be something you're not, when you're being told to stay silent or to conform, will you stand firm in your own truth? Or will you walk away from your authenticity in exchange for the comfort of the familiar? As the lights dimmed and the audience slowly filed out of the studio, a deep sense of reflection settled over everyone present. Willie Nelson wasn't just a man who walked away from a talk show. He was a man who had made an unapologetic choice. A choice that we all face at some point in our lives. What would you do if everything you stood for was questioned? What if your personal values, your integrity, your very identity were put under the microscope for the world to see? Would you stand your ground, or would you bend to fit in, to please others? Willie's walk-off wasn't just a protest. It was an act of liberation. He didn't walk away out of defeat. He didn't leave because he couldn't handle the questions or the pressure. He left because he knew that staying, compromising, and conforming would have meant sacrificing who he was, his authenticity, his truth, and his sense of self-respect. We all face moments like this in life, moments where we have to decide whether to stay true to ourselves or play the role the world expects of us. In a world that is constantly pulling us in different directions, choosing personal authenticity over external approval is not always easy. But Willie's bold stance showed us that the true power lies in making that choice. What happens when we choose to walk away from the things that no longer serve us? When we choose to walk away from the expectations, the labels, and the pressures to conform? We don't just leave something behind, we reclaim our power. This isn't about avoiding conflict or running from difficult conversations. It's about knowing when it's time to stand up for yourself, to stand firm in your values, and to walk away when the situation demands it. It's about understanding that there is strength in silence, power in walking away, and wisdom in recognizing when you no longer need to prove yourself to anyone. Willie Nelson taught us that true strength doesn't come from fitting in. It comes from standing out, standing firm in who you are, even when the world tells you that you need to change. The real question now isn't whether Willie was right or wrong in his actions. The real question is, when it's your turn to make that choice, will you be ready? When the world pressures you to conform, to stay silent, or to abandon your principles, will you have the courage to choose your truth over their expectations? Because in the end, our personal choices define who we are. And only when we live in alignment with our truth do we truly become the person we're meant to be. As time passed and the uproar of Willie Nelson's walk-off began to settle, something profound happened. What was initially seen as a controversial exit began to take on a different meaning. The conversation that had started as a public spectacle transformed into a deeper discussion about personal integrity, courage, and the complexities of standing firm in your beliefs. Willie's actions sparked a question that many people had been avoiding. What happens when we stop worrying about fitting into someone else's narrative and start living our own? What happens when we stop demanding answers that align with our worldview and start embracing the uncomfortable reality of different perspectives? In the days following the interview, people found themselves reflecting not just on Willie's words, but on their own lives. What would they have done in his place? Would they have given in just to avoid conflict? Would they have remained silent just to keep the peace? Or would they have walked away, knowing that their truth was more important than any momentary discomfort? Willie had made a bold statement that day, but it wasn't just about him. It was a message to everyone watching. He showed us that true strength isn't about being loud, it's about being resolute. It's about knowing who you are, standing firm in that knowledge, and choosing not to compromise for the sake of acceptance or approval. In a world where division and disagreement seem to be the norm, where everyone is expected to pick a side and shout their beliefs from the rooftops, Willie's walk-off reminds us that there's power in listening, in respecting the complexity of human experience, and in recognizing that we don't all have to agree to live peacefully. What if the greatest act of strength isn't fighting for your beliefs at all costs, but knowing when to step back and let your actions speak louder than your words? What if true courage lies in the willingness to walk away from the fight, not because you're defeated, but because you're confident enough in your truth to leave it behind and let it speak for itself? The truth is, there is no single answer to life's challenges. We all face moments where we're forced to choose. Do we conform or do we resist? Do we walk away or do we stay and engage? And what Willie Nelson taught us in that moment is that sometimes the greatest act of courage is the decision to walk away, to preserve our integrity and refuse to be swept into someone else's narrative. As the dust began to settle, one thing became clear. Willie Nelson's moment wasn't just a one-time confrontation. It was a call to action, a call for all of us to examine how we navigate our own lives, our own decisions, and the world around us. It was a wake-up call to recognize the importance of authenticity, resilience, and personal responsibility. Willie's walk-off wasn't about rebellion for the sake of it. It was about standing firm in what he believed, even when it was inconvenient. It was about not letting the world shape you into what it thinks you should be, but instead allowing yourself to evolve according to your values, your experiences, and your own sense of purpose. So here's the challenge. When you find yourself at a crossroads, when the world is pushing you to conform, when your beliefs are questioned, when you're faced with difficult choices, will you stand firm? Even when it feels like the whole world is telling you to back down? Life is full of moments where we're expected to fit into a box, to take a side, to conform to societal expectations. But what if the most courageous thing you could do is refuse to fit into that box? What if true strength lies in choosing your own path, unapologetically, even when the world doesn't understand? I want you to think about the moments in your life when you've been pressured to compromise who you are. Maybe it was in a relationship, a job, or a situation where you felt forced to choose between your truth and someone else's expectations. How did it feel to hold your ground? What was the cost of staying true to yourself? I'm asking you now, as you watch this and reflect on Willie's actions, what will you choose when the world demands you to conform? Will you stand firm in your values, even when it feels uncomfortable? Will you find your own voice, even when it's drowned out by others? Willie Nelson showed us that it's possible to walk away from the noise, to leave behind the labels, and to live in your truth, even when it's hard. He didn't need to shout to make a point. His walk-off was his statement, his truth. And in doing so, he left us all with a powerful message. You don't have to fit into anyone else's narrative. You don't have to sacrifice your authenticity for the sake of approval. Your truth is yours, and only you have the power to define it. So, here's my question for you. When faced with the challenge of staying true to who you are, will you choose the easy path or the courageous one? Will you walk away from the things that no longer serve you, or will you stay and let the world define your story? The power is in your hands. Your authenticity, your resilience, and your growth depend on the choices you make now. So, I challenge you to choose courage over comfort. Choose your truth over conformity. And never, ever let anyone dictate who you should be. If this message resonates with you, I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and share how you've chosen to stand firm in your beliefs. Let's start a conversation about the power of authenticity, the strength of resilience, and the courage to be ourselves. And if you haven't already, subscribe to join this journey of personal growth and empowerment. Together, we're going to keep challenging the status quo and moving forward, no matter the odds.